world is man's extraordinary. It's man's unusual. That was just the way God works, and that's exactly what He did with Abraham. And I want to close with God's plan. Real quickly, we've got 2 minutes here, and I'm going to rush through this. I want you to understand that regardless of the circumstances of Abraham's life, he lived in this godless society. He wasn't particularly significant, didn't have his own place, was apparently nomadic, hadn't put down roots, didn't really fit in, didn't feel like he was at home. He had no children, no family, in other words, and he wasn't in a position of authority. He had no authority. He was not a man of respect. But I want you to see something. If you're not where God wants you to be, it doesn't mean that you're out of God's will. It means that God's moving you. It can't mean that God's just moving you in the process. And it means that God is up to something. And if you're not where God has you finally, where He wants to finally take you, get ready to move. You see, Abraham was in Haran. He was moving toward where God wanted him, but he wasn't there yet. So if you're not where God wants you, and you sense that you're not where God wants you, get ready to move. Be prepared to move. Abraham was where God wanted him for the time being, but he wasn't where he was going to end up. God had something else in mind. He just had to get Abraham there. God has a purpose. He has a plan and He has a purpose. And moving Abraham to what would become Israel was not for Abraham's sake. He wasn't doing this for Abraham's sake. It was for the sake of Israel. It was for the sake of the world. And Abraham had no idea about that. It didn't even dawn on him. He had no idea that the Messiah was going to come through him, through his lineage. That makes sense. He had no thought about that. And God never told him that. It didn't mean that he wasn't a key part of God's purpose. It just meant that it wasn't necessary for God to explain that to him. But he was still a part of God's purpose. When God does things that you don't understand, know this. God's purpose and plan are too big for you to understand. And even when God reveals things to you, it's just a very small part. Because God's purpose and plan is much too big for you to understand. And so even if you understand a little bit, know that all you understand is just a little bit. There's a bigger picture here. You're looking at the tip of the iceberg, and God's looking at the whole picture, and He'll say, I'll tell you what you can understand, but it's too big for you to understand. You're a part of a bigger plan and purpose. You are a step up the ladder of God's plan. And there have been many steps below you that other people have built in this ladder of God's plan. And you're one of those steps. But you're an integral part. God says, you are this step that I'm putting for here for now. You are a step of God's ladder. Abraham left this beautiful land. He moved to the desert. Sometimes God has to do that, doesn't He? Sometimes He has to move us to a desert in our journey to a holy land. And that doesn't mean you're there. That doesn't mean the desert is the final destination. That means that's part of the process of where God's taking you. Sometimes God has to take you through the desert to get you to a holy land. So don't turn back. Don't turn back. It would have been disastrous if Abraham had turned back. Don't turn back. God has greater things ahead. You're on your way to your holy land, your promised land. And it doesn't make sense because God's normal is your extraordinary.